I was blessed to be the pulpit minister at the Hartville Church of Christ in Hartville, Ohio for 33 years. I came there when I was 28 years old. I sometimes have been asked, because of that, what is the key to long-term ministry in a local church? And my response is a very patient, long-suffering church. I thought about that this morning when you recognized the David Farr family. That is one of the really great characteristics of a church that would love to have a preacher for a long time. You keep treating your preacher and his family like that, and you'll make it really hard for them to go anywhere else. So I wish you the best in your endeavor to have a long-term ministry with the Farr family. After my wife passed away on Christmas morning of 2013, I struggled mightily like most people do when they lose a beloved spouse. One of the things that I refused to think about and was frankly scared to deal with is the subject of marrying again after loss. I was very fearful of me making a mistake. Me permitting my feeler to dominate my thinker and make a mistake. Because I know of people who have lost their spouse, either by divorce or by death, and have made a big mistake in marrying too soon or marrying the wrong person after they'd gone through heart-wrenching loss in their life. So I did what a lot of us do when we feel uncomfortable about something or we're scared of it. I just backed away from it. I didn't even deal with the subject in these workshops until after a few years, I got to the point where I'd been asked so many times about this subject that I thought, well, I may not like to do this, but I've got to dive into this, and I need to create some sort of a session about this subject. The third book I wrote is called After the End Comes. Not the end of the world, the end of your marriage by death, but it's applicable by divorce as well. There's a copy of that book out there on the table in the foyer as you exit this building in the front. There are 3 chapters in that book I'm most proud of because they are attempts to address subjects that I've never seen addressed in the brotherhood. For instance, there's a chapter in that book about male-female relationships after loss. And I began that chapter with one word and a period. It's the word complicated, period. Male-female relationships can be complicated under the best of circumstances. They can be complicated after loss. The next chapter in that particular book is the subject of sex after marriage. Where have you ever read about that subject? Not just sex, but sex after loss. And then the next chapter in that book that I'm very proud of is marriage after loss. Those are 3 subjects that I don't think I've seen addressed anywhere else in the brotherhood. And I wanted to make it a point of getting something out there to create thought and maybe discussion and study about that subject. Let me share with you some things that maybe you've never read or heard of before. For instance, the complication of this one particular lady who said, I would love to meet someone, but where do you go at my age to do that? I don't belong to any group or go out much, and it's hard to trust people these days. Have you ever thought about that struggle with people who've lost their spouse, either by divorce or by death? And then there was the sister in the Lord who lost her husband a month before I lost my wife. And I asked her for some feedback. This was 2.5 years after she had lost her husband. She was 19 when she got married. He was 23. They were married for 23 years, and they had 2 daughters. When the daughters were 13 and 16, on one Sunday morning, she was preparing breakfast. and sent her 13-year-old daughter down to the basement to get her father. And that 13-year-old daughter found her father dead on the floor in the basement. He had had a severe heart attack. 2.5 years later, she shares this with me. First of all, it scares me to think about this whole thing of dating and just starting over again. I'm not sure if I can love someone again like I loved Gary. I'm very lonely. I miss his companionship every day. We talked about it before, about if something were to happen to one of us, we would want the other to remarry. It was easy to say that when he was here, but now he's gone. That's much more difficult to talk about now. I would like to be able to love again, but I'm not sure that my heart is ready or I'd be able to handle that again. It also scares me because I know if I get remarried, that if my spouse goes before me again, I don't want to have to live through the pain of losing a spouse again. I don't know if I could do it again or not. Have you ever thought about what a widowed person goes through in a coupled world after they've lost a spouse, by divorce or by death? So I reached out to a brother in the Lord who was a minister of involvement at a church in East Tennessee. He basically responded, no big deal. He said, my dad died in January of 2013. There was a man at Mom's church whose wife died the day before my dad died. He took care of his wife for 12 years. I performed the wedding ceremony for Bob and my mom last April. Mom is 88 and he's 78. When I was at the Woodson Chapel Church on the south end of Nashville, I was blessed to go out to lunch with Bill and Verl. Boy, what a classic couple those two are. I want to share with you a little bit about their story. Bill's wife had ovarian cancer and she suffered for over a year. Verl's husband had Parkinson's disease for 10 years. Both were faithful caregivers. They kept their spouses at home until their spouses died. And they experienced the natural and normal agony of grieving, and neither one had thoughts of remarrying again. After 14 years of being alone, Bill's son said to his father, Dad, why don't you ask Verl out on a date? See, what can happen is your adult child becomes your parent. So Bill calls Verl one day and asks her out on a date. He was blown away. She said yes. He said, I didn't have a clue about what to do next. Well, they dated for a while. You probably know where this story is going. They fell in love. They got hitched. And I love how she ends this little story. She said, we're so much happier now. God's work can be done together. I was in Medina, Ohio, and a lady came to me and told me her story at the end of that workshop. And I said, oh, you've got to send an email and tell me about that. And so sure enough, she sent me the details in an email. I'll make it quick. She lost her husband in 2012, 38 and a half years they'd been married. He lost his wife in 2013, and he had been married for 40 years. What's funny about this story is that when they were a young adult, they were members of the same church in another state. She remembered, and of course, he was a clod. He was clueless. He didn't remember her. So here they are in north central Ohio, just south of Lake Erie, and they're members of the same church, and both of them are widowed. They went out to McDonald's for coffee Wednesday night after Bible study. She tells me in this email how that she was so nervous she was shaking and almost spilled the coffee at McDonald's. Now, I want to ask you, why in the world would a mature woman who's been married for 38 and a half years, she's sitting across the table from a brother in the Lord, why in the world would she be so nervous? Does anybody have a suggestion? It's something new. She has never done this before. She had another man in her life exclusively in a special relationship for 38 and a half years. Now she's alone. And now she's across the table from a man who's not her husband, is a brother in the Lord, and she's nervous. Well, they ended up visiting together on and off. He went to Arkansas to visit family. When he was in Arkansas visiting family, she gets diagnosed with cancer. She knows what's going to happen. But it wasn't like she thought. When he came back and she lost her hair, he was there. When she was puking her guts out because of the chemo treatments, he was there. They ended up getting married. I love how the story ends. She said, I never thought I could love someone else, and neither did he. And now they're happily married. There is a publication in the Brotherhood called the Magnolia Messenger. It's the largest distribution of a periodical in the Brotherhood, probably because it's free. Well, in this particular issue that I'm holding in my hand, spring of 2021, there's a really neat article in here about holding another's hand after the passing of your mate. And it's a story about these 6 people and how that all 6 of them have lost their spouses, but now, as this article is written, they are 3 couples. It's Hallmark-like stuff. Now you probably know where I'm headed. They don't always work that way. Gary, a deacon in the Lord's church in northeastern Ohio, he said when his father remarried, it became problematic within the family because his father was impacted spiritually by that marriage. She wasn't a Christian. And so his life in the church changed dramatically. He wasn't nearly as involved in the life of the church as he used to be. And that greatly concerned him. I have a friend in Richmond, Virginia, who shared with me a story about Effie and John. And how that Effie and John, both members of the church, both of them lost their spouses. Well, they ended up getting married. After they got married, Effie found out that she married a control freak. He would even dominate and control what she watched on TV. And she was being smothered by his control freak personality. It wasn't what she'd planned it to be. Well, then Effie ends up getting dementia. And you know what John said to this common friend of ours? John said, I didn't marry again to take care of a wife. I got married again for someone to take care of me. There's a lady who's the daughter of a shepherd in the Lord's church in the state of Indiana who posted this on her public Facebook page. Dear Facebook friends, I don't normally write personal posts, but because most of my friends on Facebook are like family to me, I want to tell you about the recent events of my life. I know some of you have been concerned about me, and I appreciate that more than you know. It's hard to talk to everyone all the time, so maybe this post will answer some questions and elicit some prayers. Please know that this is difficult for me to write. I just am so ashamed that I made such an impulsive decision. As most of you know, my husband, Jim, passed away June of 2014. He forever changed my life, and his passing forever changed my life. I was vulnerable, devastated, and naive. I met someone months later, and we were married July of 2015. June of 2014, July of 2015. While that may seem very quick, at the time, I couldn't see that. I was lonely and should never have remarried so quickly. I don't want to go into all the details on Facebook, but after several heartaches with this person, we are now divorcing. Being a teacher in a small town for 25 years lends itself to knowing many, many people. I'm taking back Jim's last name. He was the love of my life and my soulmate. Please pray for me and Lexi as we continue to grieve for Jim and as I move forward from this very embarrassing situation. You all know that all I ever wanted was a loving marriage like many of you have. Research indicates, and this is research done by the U.S. Census Bureau, that over half of all marriages in the first 2 years of loss end in divorce. That shocked me because I was thinking naively that, boy, with marital experience in the past, when I got married when I was 19 years old, I didn't have a clue. I didn't have any life experience. I'd never been married before. I thought, when two people have marital experience, and especially if they've experienced loss, which really causes you to appreciate what you had that you lost, I would have thought that moving into a second marriage, the rate of success would be much higher. But over half end in divorce if married within 2 years. Sometimes what happens is we human beings self-medicate. A person with clinical depression, for instance, can self-medicate with liquor, with alcohol. Or they might self-medicate with meth. But self-medicating is not a wise thing to do. Sometimes we can self-medicate our grief by choosing to do something that may end in a train wreck being experienced after already going through the heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching experience of the loss of a spouse. So what we're going to talk about is marriage, and we're going to talk about it with a special emphasis on after loss, but we're not going to ignore the fundamentals of marriage to help those who've never been married. It's obvious in the Bible that a person who's lost their spouse has every right in the world to be married again. If her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes. And then there's that phrase at the end of that verse, only in the Lord. Now, what have you heard about that only in the Lord phrase? Somebody tell me, what is the way that we a lot of times see that or interpret that? Okay, somebody who's a member of the church. Somebody who has been baptized into Jesus Christ and who is a Christian. Now, there's another possibility about that phrase. There have been many articles written about that phrase and about this verse. There have even been books written about this subject. I want to suggest to you there's another possibility. The in the Lord phrase could refer to the marriage, not to the person. In other words, that the marriage is in the Lord. It's acceptable to the Lord. I would not stake the welfare of my soul on either view. But one thing I can say without fear of successful contradiction is that is a restrictive phrase. Only in the Lord is a restrictive phrase. Could we at least admit, can we at least have a consensus that that's like a red flag? Saying, be careful. You know, there are concerns God has in his book about our marital arrangements. This could deal with the legitimacy of the marriage. Do you remember what happened with John the Baptizer when he got his head chopped off? What prompted that? What did he have the guts to say to Herod? It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Evidently, some people don't have any business married to some people. And then you've got this conversation in John chapter 4 where Jesus says in verse 16, go call your husband and come here. And the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said, you have well said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband. In that you spoke truly. We human beings are really good at 2 things. Number 1, taking our blessings for granted. And number 2, messing up blessings God has given us. Marriage is a wonderful, rich blessing, but we're good at messing it up. We're very creative. And what a mess we can create sometimes. I'm not going to get into all the tall weeds of the marriage, divorce, and remarriage issue. I simply point out that not everybody has any business married to just anybody. There needs to be a legitimacy to the marriage. Whichever this refers to, what I can say for sure, it's a restrictive phrase. We need to be careful. But we need to be careful the first time. I made it a practice. It was just a personal policy. It wasn't founded on Scripture. It was more founded on my principles and my personal conscience, where I didn't perform ceremonies for people who were Christians who were choosing to marry people who were not Christians. Not because I thought it was sinful, because I don't think it is. I defend their right to do that. But I just think it's soul gambling, and I don't want to participate in it. Now, I'll buy them a gift. I'll attend the wedding. I'll even do their premarital counseling, and I'll counsel them afterwards if they struggle. But I just don't want to publicly endorse that. My recommendation is, whether it's a first marriage or any other marriage, make sure that you have a right to be married, and make sure that other person has a right to be married, and make sure that you and that other person are both Christians. And that is the best approach. Now, there's been a lot of work, a lot of study done about marriages again, either after divorce or after loss. And Einstein, I think, makes a very good observation here. A key here is resolving and mourning the loss of the former relationship. If you were not here yesterday, one of the things that we emphasized is that after loss, we human beings need to grieve. And we need to really focus on deeply grieving our losses in whatever way is productive and good for us to process our loss. We need to do it as long as we need to do it. It's really important that we do that. We need to make sure that we don't make big decisions, important decisions, especially lifetime commitments, without resolving and mourning the past relationships that we no longer have. So we need to be careful about the timing. I love this observation. I think it's so true. You have to be okay on your own before you can have a healthy relationship with another person. If you being okay is dependent on you being in a relationship with another person, think about how unstable that your okay is. That is extremely risky. The Bible even encourages some to remarry. Younger widows, marry. Bear children. Manage the household, so that the temptations aren't persistent. So remarriage is even encouraged. Philippians chapter 4, I think, is a crucial passage to look at in regard to this subject. We're very familiar with that statement that you see on the screen. I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. Oh, to have the faith and maturity of the Apostle Paul. That's a pretty high bar, but it's not an impossible bar to achieve. Paul proved it. Let me look at the context here and read it, and maybe you might want to follow along. Philippians 4, verse 11, not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things, I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Now that verse 13 is sometimes lifted out of context as if it were some sort of universally applicable statement. And it's not. In the context, he's not talking about running a 4-minute mile. I mean, if you think you can do that through Christ who strengthens you, have at it. Maybe it'd be good for your health. He's talking about, I can be content no matter what my circumstances, and it's not because of me. And it's not because of my circumstance. It's because of Jesus Christ who lives in me. He's the one that gives me the strength to find contentment no matter what my circumstances are. That's what he's talking about. Now, I want you to look at this passage for a minute, and I want to be so bold as to stick some words in this passage and ask you if they apply. I have learned in whatever state, okay, that's condition or circumstance is the idea. I have learned in whatever financial state I am to be content. What do you think? Possible? Through Christ who strengthens you, yes. I have learned in whatever physical state I am to be content. Is that possible? What if you had a leg amputated because of a diabetic condition? What if you could no longer walk? What if you were diagnosed with cancer? Can a cancer patient be content? Can that person with only one leg be content? Yes, if that contentment hinges on Jesus Christ. I have learned in whatever marital state I am to be content. That's a hard one. That's a really hard one. I say that as one who knows about flying solo in a coupled world. I know you may think that me making that remark about a coupled world, he's being overly dramatic. Let me prove my point. I was at the Freed-Hardeman University lectureship. And the Freed-Hardeman Associates raise money for scholarships for students at Freed-Hardeman. Every year, when my wife lovingly, supportively stayed at home, took care of the kids, I went to the lectureship, I always bought her something at the table that the associates had. This past February, I attended that lectureship. I walked up to the table. The lady on the other side said, "Hey, before you leave, you want to make sure that you buy something to take home to your wife." I hesitated for a minute, wondering if I should say something. I don't want to hurt her feelings, but I feel a need to educate her. And I said, "Well, I lost my wife Christmas Day of 2013. What do you think?" she said. "I'm sorry." I hated to do that to her, but it was a good educational time for her. You see, we live in a coupled world. I was in the airport in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And usually when I travel by plane, I have two 50-pound suitcases or pieces of luggage. Well, the one was about 51 and a half or so. So I was told I needed to take some out of one and put in another. On that particular occasion, when I went to that congregation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, I traveled with a friend of mine, a female friend of mine, and she had already checked in. And so this guy, he reaches out at the counter at Southwest Airlines. He reached out to get what I was taking out of the one to put in the other. And he said, "Here, I'll hand that stuff to your wife." She was to my right. See the assumption? If you want to save yourself some embarrassment, don't assume that a male and a female out in public are married. Don't assume that. You can find that out in other ways. You can direct the conversation in other ways and find that out. Don't assume that. It might make you feel uncomfortable. It might make them feel uncomfortable. We live in a coupled world. Those of us who have never married, those of us who've gone through the agony of divorce, those of us who have lost our spouse by death, we're a minority. We're social misfits in a coupled world. And that is a struggle. And it's hard to be content. Now, some people, if they've had a great marriage, it's natural for them to want another great marriage, a second bite at the sweet marital apple. And then you've got people who've been married, who lost their spouse, and they had a miserable marriage. And they want a bite of a different apple that tastes better. They want a chance for a great marriage. It's a challenge to be alone, especially after you've experienced the blessings of marriage. But it can be done. As a matter of fact, godliness with contentment is great gain. Maybe one reason why it's a great gain is because it's really hard to get there in your spiritual life and your journey with Jesus. I've been often asked, you discourage impetuous decisions about this subject, so when is it good for a person to go ahead and get married the second time? And I know what they're asking. They're asking for a number. They're wanting a number of months. They're wanting a number of years. And I can't answer it that way. But here's what I can say, and here's what I recommend. And here's what I've done in my own personal life. When you have wrestled with this challenging issue of flying solo in a coupled world, and you've lost that blessing of marriage, and you have struggled with your relationship with the Lord, and you have grown to the point where you're content in your present marital status, that is a great time to be married again. Because you're not marrying out of desperation. You're not marrying out of a felt need. You're married because you want to be married. Sometimes out of desperation, people have chosen to get remarried to the wrong person or too soon. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can even be content as a single person, as a widowed person, as a divorcee, through Jesus Christ who strengthens me. But it's hard to get there. There are things that need to be considered before marriage, whether you're talking about a first marriage or you're talking about any other marriage. What should be considered? There are myths and there are facts about marriage, and I think we need to make sure that we ourselves understand the difference between the myths and the facts, the contemporary myths and the facts, and we need to make sure we teach them to our children and to our grandchildren. There's a book that I used in premarital counseling for many years called Fit to be Tied. And in that book, this husband and wife team, in that chapter about things that ought to be considered in regard to myths and truths, they talk about these four things. Marriage will end my aloneness. Marriage will heal my brokenness. What if you have two people up here and the one has an eating disorder of some sort, and that's a part of their brokenness, and they say, I do. Are they still going to have that issue? Yeah. It's not going to change their brokenness. Saying I do doesn't change who we are. And have you ever known of a married person who was unhappy? You know, marriage will ensure my happiness. There are three kinds of marriages. There are miserable marriages, there are mediocre marriages, and then there are the kinds that the children of God should have, magnificent marriages, where we participate in the total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. And whether it's a first marriage or one that's after that first marriage, we can have a magnificent marriage despite the fact we're two flawed people. We need to understand there's myths and there are facts. The most important thing, the trump card, and I hesitate to use that phrase. The trump card for marriage is spiritual compatibility. If you want to help me find my wife, my second wife, I'll tell you what's most important. She loves somebody else more than me. And that's her Lord Jesus Christ. I love to tell the story about my church secretary for some 17 years. He was in the Air Force, a military macho man. She was exposed to the gospel and became a Christian. He gave her a hard time. He had no interest in church, God, the Bible, religion. She kept being pressured by him. And at one point she said to him, Jim, if you keep pressing me, if you make me choose, you will not win. I'll choose Jesus. Our brother Jim Kidd is now an elder in the Lord's church because his wife loved Jesus more than him. But before we find that person, we need to be that person. Randy Pope wrote a book called Finding Your $1 Million Mate. I highly recommend it. If you've never been married and you're interested in marrying sometime in your future, great book, easy reading, but really powerful in content. The one thing I would change about that book is I'd write the first chapter about being and becoming someone's prospective $1 million mate, the man or the woman in the mirror. Then find that $1 million mate that also loves Jesus more than anybody else or anything else. I'm not talking about somebody who goes to the same church you do, somebody who has a baptismal certificate just like you do. I'm talking about a person who loves the Lord more than anybody else or anything else. You have two people who have that spirit about them. That's the trump card. Time is the acid test of a relationship. Whenever we meet somebody and we begin to relate with the opposite gender, which foot do we put forward? What do we call it? The best foot forward. Now, is that always reality? Are you always your best? Oh my. Sometimes you're the pitiful, okay, foot forward. But see, initially though, we only put the best foot forward. Over a period of time, what happens is we begin through experience. Remember, life is people, relationships, and experiences. That's life. Over a period of time, with different experiences with that person, you cultivate a relationship and you begin to find out who that person really is. How are they when they're angry? How do they respond to pressure, to disappointment? How do they handle their money? How do they treat other people? You find out that over a period of time. There's family blending that occurs, especially midlife or later. And that blending can be a real challenge. This person that you may help me find, who not only loves God more than anybody else or anything else, that person can also pass 11 tests. I have 3 daughters. I have 3 sons-in-law. I have 5 grandchildren. I personally, now other people feel differently. I know I'm talking about brothers and sisters in the Lord feel differently about this, but I personally have no intention of marrying somebody who in marrying them is going to distance me from any of my present family. I want them to be able to embrace her lovingly as a sister in the Lord. And I want to be able to be embraced by her family as well. There's expectations as well, and those expectations are from past experiences. When I grew up as a kid, my mama would sometimes buy Campbell's pork and beans. The first mistake my little wife at 19 years old made in Henderson, Tennessee, at 19 years old, she had the gall to open up a can of Campbell's pork and beans. She put them in a bowl and expected me to eat them at room temperature. My mother would never have done that. You got to heat that stuff in that can. See, past expectations, not just from your home you grew up in, but also a previous marriage if you were married previously. What are the expectations? We need to talk frankly and freely about these things. Transparency is really important. One of the most romantic dates we're going to go on with this lady that you're helping me find. And by the way, I forgot to mention, she's knocked down dead gorgeous too. Put that on the list, okay? Okay, now we're going to walk hand in hand to Walmart and we're going to buy a Zebco rod and reel. Do you guys know that you get tackle with the Zebco rod and reels now in Walmart? I didn't know that till the other day. It's really cool. Well, we're going to go and we're going to buy a Zebco rod and reel with tackle. We're going to wrap it up, and we're going to walk hand in hand. This is going to be very romantic. We're going to go to my doctor, and we're going to give him the present, the rod and reel, and he's going to tell us about my health. And then we're going to go get some candy and some flowers, and we're going to go it's very romantic, we're going to go hand in hand to her doctor, and her doctor is going to tell us about her health. I talk about it in that way to help us understand we need to talk about the health of each other. Again, transparently. Do you think there's ever been somebody who got married to somebody else and they didn't know about their health condition? Do you think that's ever happened? And then there's finances. It can be so complicated. I can't believe I put prenup on there. I have preached against prenuptial agreements since the first time we came up with that crazy idea. That is about the dumbest thing we've ever done in our culture. It's like programming your marriage for failure is what it is. However, when you have adult children who may be a little cranky and a tad selfish and think that their inheritance, which is really not their inheritance until I croak or they croak, well, a prenuptial agreement might calm the seas a little bit in regard to that issue. But there's a lot of things to be talked about. Everything's on the table. Every dime. Every penny. And the thoughts and feelings about those finances. And then where are we going to live? We're going to live in Florida? We're going to live in Ohio? We're going to go to SoCal? We're going to go to Big D? That's Duncanville, by the way. That's what Charles Hodge used to say. That's Duncanville, Texas, not Dallas, Texas. Are we going to keep both houses? When is the time to talk about all of that before you say, I do? The whole point of what I'm trying to suggest is we need to understand there are risk factors. We cannot eliminate risks. In human relationships, you cannot eliminate risks. When you choose to be a friend with somebody, you are risking. Because friends sometimes betray friends, neglect friends. Even we in the church, sometimes brothers and sisters in the Lord, we sin against one another even. It's a risk, but there's reward. There's great reward, so we risk. But it's a really good idea to try, if you can, lower the risks as best you can to raise the possibility of things going good. Remarriage at midlife or later is a lot like the merger of two major corporations, like Sprint and T-Mobile. They got hitched. But there are times two major corporations invest millions of dollars sometimes in the research and commit themselves to this study for months and even years, and then they back away because they see it's not a good idea. If a corporation does that about something as insignificant as money and stockholders, surely we ought to do that with something as sacred as a marriage relationship. I just encourage us to make our marriage magnificent. And that starts with the individual. We have no control over the other one, just us. But invest into the total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. And then if you lose that and you want to seek another one, I highly recommend thinking about some of the things I shared tonight. If it's not helped you, maybe this will help you help somebody else along the way. I want to thank this church for letting me come. I've heard about this church for a long time. I'll be bragging about this church for a long time. And I want to mention one more thing. I love your participation in the Lads to Leaders Leaderettes program. My children, my 3 daughters, are faithful Christians, and I credit that a lot to their mother and the Lads to Leaders Leaderettes program and the healthy church environment in Hartville, Ohio, at that precious church that I was with for a third of a century. Commit yourself to those kids. They deserve every ounce of effort you put in to them growing up the way God would want them to grow up. Thanks, David.